I may have been tempted to walk out the door the other way and say, no, thank you. I don't want to hear a sermon on that today. It's been a long week, a tough week. I think I'd rather hear about just about anything else but the judgment of God. So thank you for being here today. And I hope that it'll be a different experience than what you're thinking today. Last Sunday, we walked into church, and many of us already had our minds on the East Coast. We were hearing things about Frankenstorm, a storm that had been nicknamed that because of the fact that somewhere around Halloween, it was expected that a massive hurricane was going to strike the East Coast. And there were some who wondered, is that really going to happen? Because we have such a day and age of sensationalistic journalism, it feels like stories are created sometimes and never happen. And over the week, maybe you heard that there's two types of hurricanes, types of people who look at track hurricanes. There's a European model and there's a North American model. We've typically used the North American model. And the North American model was showing that the hurricane was supposed to start going toward the East Coast and then would head back into the ocean. The European model said it's going to be a direct hit on the East Coast and some of the most heavily populated areas of our nation. And it proved to be that the European model held true. And our East Coast in the United States this week has endured a vicious hit. There are those today who are in church across the East Coast who last week were worshiping with loved ones and today are missing loved ones. There are those who are worshiping in churches and don't have their homes this week. There are those who are standing in line for 6 hours for gas, hoping that they might be able to get gas for their cars. There are those who are screaming out to the government or anyone who will listen for answers to help them get food stocked in their grocery stores. And it's always a shocking and a sad thing when something like this happens to our country. And tragically, shortly after Hurricane Sandy hit, there were those voices of men and women who call themselves followers of Jesus Christ, who shouted that this is the wrath of God on America. It's the wrath of God on our nation for sin. It's the judgment of God that has descended upon the East Coast. And these people generated news for saying that these hurricanes were God's judgment with no love in their voices. And let me tell you, when hurricanes and events like this happen, I believe that God's heart is broken too. And I believe that God's heart is broken when he hears people who call themselves followers of God, who immediately, without compassion, shout judgment. When God has called his children in all generations to be people, when tragedies come, to be people of compassion, people who respond with justice, showing mercy, compassion, and love. Let me share some troubling statistics with you about the state of our world today. Did you know that there are 870 million people in the world today who don't have enough to eat? And 98% of those people live in developing countries. Do you know that 40,000 people today around planet Earth will die from starvation? Extrapolate that over 365 days a year, and that means that this year, like the many years that have preceded it, about 14,600,000 people will die because of starvation. It's a tragic thing. Do you know that more than half the people who live in the world today, in a day and age where we have the internet and we have more available to us than ever to get information out there, half the people in the world today have still never heard the name Jesus Christ. And did you know that today, 1/3 of American young girls will be sexually abused before the age of 18? I don't know about you, but when I hear statistics like that, my heart breaks. I'm reminded of Bob Pierce, who was the founder of World Vision, who years ago, as a young man, prayed, "May my heart break for the things that break the heart of God." When I first heard that quote many years ago, it resonated with me. And it's something that oftentimes I pray. You'll hear me pray here at church that God would give us the eyes of Jesus for the world. My prayer is that my heart never becomes calloused when I hear about 14 million people who will die this year because of starvation. It becomes so easy to hear numbers like that, and they just become numbers. It's just a lot of people. And we forget that every one of those numbers is an individual and a family that's gripped with this devastating decision. Families that say, well, which child do we feed today? Mothers who have unspeakable decisions that they have to make to support their family and their children. Bob Pierce, the guy who said, "May my heart break with the things that break the heart of God," in 1947 was an evangelist with a new organization called Youth for Christ. Youth for Christ began right after World War II. It was a ministry that was begun because all these young American GIs were coming back home, and they wanted to reach these GIs for Christ, and they were getting married young. We think of it as a high school ministry, but it was really begun for these GIs coming back from the war. And as the ministry spread, all these evangelists were springing up for Youth for Christ in all of these towns and communities around our country. And every community had an evangelist that would come on staff with Youth for Christ, and they'd hold these rallies, and everyone from teenagers to these GIs would come, and they'd hear about Jesus, and God just did some incredible things, and Bob Pierce was one of those guys. And he was this young idealistic evangelist, and he decided after doing that for a few years, he wanted to take the message of Jesus Christ to the country of China. China was experiencing a humanitarian crisis in the 1940s, much like many of the countries that we see in Africa. There were children starving all over China. He had seen the pictures. He wanted to go and experience it himself, and he wanted to bring the good news of Jesus Christ to China. So like any young evangelist who was single at the time, didn't have a lot of money, who had parents who were probably supporting him, he took all the money that he could to get to China, and he made it to Honolulu, Hawaii. That's how much money he had. He had enough to get to Honolulu. Tough place to get stuck, all right? So he goes to Honolulu, Hawaii on his way to share the gospel in China, and he's stuck in Honolulu, and while there he meets a woman named Tina Holdecker, a teacher. And she introduces him to this battered and abandoned child that she had been caring for, whose name was White Jade. And unable to care for the child herself, she asked Pierce, "What are you going to do about her?" How would you like it if somebody asked you that question? You're walking downtown Minneapolis, and you strike up a conversation with a teacher in North Minneapolis who knows about a student who is abused at home and says, "Hey, what are you going to do about this child?" And Bob Pierce has been praying, "God, make my heart break with the things that break your heart." And so he decides that he's going to give the last $5 in his pocket to Lena Holdecker to help this child out. And then he promises her that he'll send her the same amount each month to help the woman care for the child. Well, Pierce eventually made his way to China, where thousands of people made commitments as followers of Jesus Christ during 4 months of evangelistic rallies. And while there, Pierce saw widespread hunger. It is said that he felt compassion for others, and it is during this time that, again, he writes these words in the flyleaf of his Bible, "Let my heart be broken with the things that break the heart of God." There's this invention that had been around for a couple of decades at that point called the movie camera that he decided to take with him into China to chronicle what it was that he was seeing. And so he begins to take movies of these children in China and the starvation that he's seeing firsthand. And when he comes back to the United States in the 1950s, he begins to take these films to churches like ours all over the country and share with Christians, "Listen, this is what's happening in China. Would you consider adopting one of these children? Would you consider sending in a certain amount of money each month to me, and I'll get it to these missionaries, and we'll love on these children?" He had no formal program set up. He just knew he was going to send it to the missionaries he knew who were caring for these kids, and they were going to take care of these kids. And thus started the idea of World Vision, and the idea of World Vision supporting children. In 1959, journalist Richard Gaiman wrote of Pierce that he cannot conceal his true emotions. "He seems to me to be one of the few naturally, uncontrollably honest men I have ever met." And Richard Halverson, who became the chaplain of the United States Senate, wrote that Pierce prayed more earnestly and importantly than anyone else I've ever known. It was as though a prayer burned within him. Bob Pierce functioned from a broken heart. His prayer that God would break his heart for the things that break the heart of God had come true in his life. Even when he got older, in 1968, he retired from World Vision. Leukemia started to rack his body. He died in 1978 from leukemia. But before he died, he couldn't stand the 2 years of retirement as he battled his sickness, so he started a new ministry. And he called it Samaritan's Purse. And today, Samaritan's Purse is one of the biggest Christian relief organizations in the world as well, delivering shoeboxes to children all over the world at Christmas time. One man founds World Relief and Samaritan's Purse because his heart broke with the things that break the heart of God. I believe with all my heart that God wants his church to operate with a broken heart when it comes to the things that break God's heart. James, who was the half-brother of Jesus, in James 1:27, wrote the following: "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world." There was no question in the mind of the Apostle James that true religion cares for people in need, that God's people ought to be people who serve. In James 2:5, he writes, "Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him?" Again, echoing the idea in these verses that God's people serve because it honors him. He commands it. James tells us there are three groups of people that Christians are to serve: the widows, the orphans, and the poor. It's a non-negotiable thing. If we're a follower of Jesus Christ, we need to care about the poor. Earlier today, Jerry Vogler shared with you about a program that our vision team and our elders have been praying and fasting about for months. I am so excited. We were going to wait to roll out the Reach 15 description until the annual meeting. We were going to put these brochures out today. We couldn't wait. So we're going to start sharing this week because it's just too exciting. And there are so many goals in here. And as Jerry shared about Reach 15, pick one of these up on your way out. There's one per family. And page 3 has all these ministry initiatives. And Jerry said there's like 10 of them. You ought to find something that you can get excited about. It was so cool as we began to share these with the vision team. Every one of these resonated with somebody else in the vision team. There was this thing, maybe we don't put this one in. No, we've got to keep that one in because, there was just this passion as a church that God's calling us to do great things. But I'm going to tell you right now as your pastor, there is no way we can accomplish everything on here the size that we are today. And one of the first goals of Reach 15 is that we as a church would double in the next 3 years as far as attendance goes. And I want to tell you, we have no interest in doubling by taking people from different churches and having them come here. We want to see this church double in attendance because Jesus commanded that as followers and disciples of Jesus Christ, that it is one of our first and foremost responsibilities to reach our friends and our neighbors who have no relationship with Jesus Christ with the gospel. In the first service, I was talking about our junior hires and senior hires who were meeting down the hall at that time. And there's something about this generation that says, listen, we don't care about what you're doing across the world if you're not first doing something across the street. And we've done a great job when it comes to missions around the world, and we're going to continue, by God's grace, to do a great job around the world. But we've got to take seriously the commandment that God has given us in our backyard to reach our neighbors with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so, if nothing else happened in here, we better get serious about reaching people who need Jesus Christ with the gospel. But then about 4 or 5 down on this list of things that we believe that God is calling us to do is this thing that simply says ministry to orphans, widows, refugees, prisoners, and the oppressed. Scripture is clear that God is passionate about these communities. I got to tell you how this emerged. Number one, God's been doing some amazing things in Haiti. You heard some testimonies last week about what God is doing through some of the families in our church. I have a friend named Troy Dobbs who's the pastor of Grace Church in Eden Prairie, and Grace is one of these suburban mega churches here in the Twin Cities. But God's doing some amazing things at Grace right now. And Troy was preaching a sermon at Grace that was a little bit similar to where we're going with Reach 15. And I listened to this sermon, and I told our vision team, you've got to listen to this message. It's one of the best messages that I've heard in vision. But what really resonated with me was Troy said, hey, at Grace, we've got to take seriously this whole thing about orphans. God's told us as the church that we're supposed to care about orphans and the unborn. And so we're going to start a ministry for orphans and the unborn. And he begins to unpack this with the people of Grace Church, not sure how they're going to respond. The elders and the pastors have been praying about this. But he says, we got to get serious about ministry to orphans. And we can't, as Grace Church, adopt every single orphan in the world, but we can do something about some of those orphans. And so we're going to begin to make that a priority in our church. And for those families who feel called to adopt but can't afford to adopt, we're going to start a fund for from families that can afford to adopt but don't feel called to adopt that maybe they can give to so that we can make a difference there. And so he's like challenging this church, people who could give toward this, to say, hey, God cares about the orphans, and we've got some families that are ready. Let's help them get to the point where they can adopt. I think that's pretty cool. But then he took it a step further. He said, we have lots of orphans in our backyard here in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota, and they're the children in our foster care system. And why can't the Church of Jesus Christ working together help to make foster care a thing of the past in the state of Minnesota? So that the church is caring for orphans. And what if we put together a network of churches that came together and together tried to tackle this issue? Because it's always been the church throughout history who's cared for orphans. And now listen, I know that there are some practical implications that will make that almost impossible, because there's always going to be some kids that go into emergency foster care who are going to go back to their original homes, and there's that type of foster care. But what about those kids nobody wants? Should that be the case in Minnesota, where we have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who call themselves followers of Jesus Christ? What if churches began to work together? I emailed Troy, as we talked about this in our vision team, and there were certain people this really resonated with. And so Troy, I watched your message, and we'd love to be involved as one of the churches that would be involved just in the network of churches working together. And he emailed back, he said, I'm so excited to hear that you're the first person that's even contacted me from another church. And he says, I can't wait to share this with our elders and our pastors, because it is something that's a controversial type deal, that big, big thing to attach. And then I told him a little bit about the story of what God is doing at our church in Haiti right now, and said, if you need some help there. We're a small church, but we're doing some pretty cool things there. And it's so exciting to see what God can do when his people come together. God cares for orphans, so should we. And I love what he's doing. If you weren't with us last week and you didn't get to see the testimony of these two families, the Piercys and the Harreltons, who are adopting sons from the same orphanage, it's online. You can go to our website and check that out. It's an incredible story. I don't think there's anyone over the last 100 or so years in history that has impacted as many people in the community of the poor as Mother Teresa. And I know she was Catholic and we're Protestant, and I don't care. Let's look at some of the things she said, because it's really cool. She once said, holiness is not the luxury of the few, it's everyone's duty, yours and mine. Is people who are holy are people who've been set apart by God for a purpose in their generation. And as followers of Jesus, we don't really have a choice. God calls us to live holy lives. It's not the luxury of the few. It's everyone's duty. Holiness does not consist in doing extraordinary things. It consists in accepting with a smile what Jesus sends us. It consists in accepting and following the will of God. And for her, accepting and following the will of God meant that she was led to the slums of Calcutta, India, living in the worst of the worst conditions, and doing it with joy. And sometimes in our American way of thinking, we think, we want to be happy and comfortable, and you couldn't possibly have joy living in a place like that. But there's a difference between happiness and joy, and there is a contentment that comes when we follow Jesus, no matter the cost, that will bring a joy that sometimes the world doesn't understand. She says, I ask you one thing, do not tire of giving, but do not give your leftovers. Give until it hurts, until you feel the pain. And I know there are so many of you here that do so well at that. You've given of yourself in so many ways. And there's others of us who want to do what Mother Teresa said. We kind of want to get the leftovers. Let's go to the next slide. She said, today it's fashionable to talk about the poor. Unfortunately, it's not fashionable to talk with them. When's the last time as a family you invited over a poor family? And said, would you share a meal with us? When's the last time that you really sat down with someone with real, tangible needs and learned about them and heard the story behind it and heard some of the pain that's there? When's the last time you saw the guy with the sign on the street that was asking for money and you actually stopped to talk and listen to the story and what's behind that? And not just assume he's a con artist or he's a drunk or he's an addict and use that as the convenient excuse to ignore that person. If we worry too much about ourselves, we won't have time for others. It's election week in America, and we've heard a lot about the economy. And there are many of us who worry about ourselves because of where our finances are right now. But listen, if we spend all of our time worrying about ourselves, then we don't have time for others. And this life isn't about us. It's about others. Only one life will soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. What is a Christian? Someone asked a Hindu man. He responded, a Christian is someone who gives. That was the reputation that Mother Teresa had in India, that even the Hindus that she was working with saw Christians as people who gave. What a great reputation to have. So you may be at this point in the sermon saying, okay, Brian, it says, are you ready to face God's judgment? What's that have to do with God's judgment? And are you going to preach on that or not today? Well, I believe that I'm speaking on the poor today because shortly before he went to the cross, Jesus taught his disciples about the future of every single human being. Someday, every one of us are going to appear before God's judgment seat. Every man and boy, woman and girl who's ever lived. We're going to stand before God. And Jesus told his disciples that he is going to someday separate humanity into two groups. And one group is going to experience eternal life with God in heaven. Another group is going to be subject to judgment. And I think that Jesus clearly shows us that true followers of Christ are those whose belief impacts their actions. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew 25. When the Son of Man comes in glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. And then the king will say to those on the right, come, you who are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you before the foundation of the world. Stop there for a second. Can you imagine what that's going to be like? Can you imagine that day when you stand before the throne of God and you hear those words? Do you think that's going to feel blessed? You think that's going to feel good? And then he says, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And then the righteous will answer him saying, Lord, when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick and in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of my brothers, you did it to me. Do you see it? True followers of Christ are people whose beliefs impact their actions. I love that those who are before Christ's judgment seat are almost unaware of the fact that they've done any of this. Jesus, when did we see you hungry and give you something to eat? When did we see you naked and clothed you? When did we see you in prison and come visit you? They have become so much like Christ in their actions and in their thoughts that they are unaware of the fact that when they are doing this, they're doing it for him. Jesus expanded what James told us, and he tells us, look, I want you to serve the poor, the sick, the prisoners, your neighbors, people of different cultures. You see it all in this passage. And when we are before God's judgment seat, he's going to judge us for our works as well as our faith. He cares about how we treat others. The great commandment is that we would love the Lord our God with all our soul and mind and strength. The second is like it, that we would love our neighbor as ourselves. Jesus taught that we are to love widows and orphans like James, but he goes further in Matthew 25. You know what? For me, it's really easy to have a heart for a starving child. I see those pictures from World Vision and World Relief and Samaritan's Purse and UNICEF and all these other groups of children who are starving, and my heart is just tugged and wretched. And yet Jesus says, guess what? I want you to have that same heart of compassion for the rapist that's behind bars right now. I want you to have that same heart of compassion for the person who murdered and took the life of that little girl's father. I want you to have the same heart of compassion for the one who doesn't deserve it. And I read something like that and I go, really? You want me to love the prisoner too? You want me to love the one who doesn't deserve it? You want me to love the scum of the earth? Jesus says, yeah, now you're getting it. Because Schulenburg, I love you. I love you. And you don't deserve it. You see, that's what grace is. God's grace is given to people who don't deserve it. Compassion is a non-negotiable thing for the follower of Christ. Christians are called to be people of compassion. It was Christians who began the first hospitals in the world. It was Christians who began the first public institutions of education in this world. It was Christians who did those things. There are some who balk at Jesus' words in Matthew 25. It's almost as Jesus is saying that we don't have to earn our salvation, that we have to earn our salvation by doing good things. And we know that's not true. Because throughout Scripture, Jesus says, listen, it's not by works of righteousness which you have done. It's the righteousness of God that's being imputed upon us that allows any of us to stand before a righteous God. It's because Jesus went to the cross and the furious wrath of God was poured upon Jesus on Calvary that any of us can stand before God. Salvation isn't earned by doing good things, but doing good things are proof that you've been saved. And woe to the person who thinks I'm getting to heaven because I prayed some prayer and this emotional moment as this fire insurance that would keep me out of hell, but whose life didn't change one bit. Woe to the person who isn't passionate about those things and those people that God is passionate about. James tackled this issue in James 2:14-20. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to him, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. That's the description. It's this idea of just being absolutely useless, of being rubbish, of being trash. That's what faith without works is like. But somebody will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe that and they shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? It's dead, it's useless, it's trash. God cares about us who call ourselves followers of Jesus, living like He did. How does Jesus respond to His enemies? He loves them. How does Jesus respond to those who heap abuse upon Him? He takes it. And then He takes it so much that He goes to the cross and allows that abuse to be fully poured upon Him. And there are those who call themselves followers of Jesus Christ who want to blame hurricanes as the wrath of God. And they want to pour abuse on others who don't believe the way that we believe. And God has no spot for that. Matthew 25:31-46, Jesus speaks to another group of folks at the judgment seat. Then He will say to those on His left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. And then they will also answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister to you? And then He will answer them, saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. It would be terrible to be that person in that moment, standing before God and receiving that news. A true follower of Jesus Christ is one who's going to have compassion towards others. Many years ago, I read the following piece by an author who we don't know who it was that wrote this, but it became a popular piece entitled, I Was Hungry. It says, I was hungry, and you formed a humanities club and discussed my hunger. Thank you. And I was in your mind, and I was naked, and in your mind you debated the morality of my appearance. I was homeless, and you preached to me of the spiritual shelter of the love of God. I was imprisoned, and you crept off quietly to your chapel in the cellar, and prayed for my release. I was sick, and you knelt and thanked God for your health. I was lonely, and you left me alone to pray for me. I'd like to take a couple of moments here, a couple minutes, to think about the question, so what can we do? What is it that we should be doing as God's people in this generation? We've already said that part of Reach 15 is a new initiative to do something about the people that Jesus cares about. If you've got a piece of paper in front of you, or maybe you follow electronically on our YouVersion notes and there's a spot for you to just type in there, I'd like you to write down some ideas that God gives you about how we can minister to people in our generation in the following areas: widows, orphans, poor, sick and disabled, prisoners, neighbors, people of different culture. You know, there's like 7 things there. And if we were ministering to one person a day in each one of those different categories, we'd be like busy 7 days a week. God didn't call us to do this alone, all right? He gave us the body. And some of you are already doing this. I'm blown away by our Refugee Life Ministry and what they're accomplishing. And they're mostly accomplishing that apart from me. I'm a cheerleader for them, and I'm excited about that. But I haven't been able to give the time I want to give there. But there's people who are doing that would say, that's about all I have the time to do right now. And that's great. You pray about what it is that God's calling you to do. I want to close with one other quote from Mother Teresa as you write. A reporter asked Mother Teresa, "What motivated you to commit your life to the sick and dying?" And her reply was, "I haven't committed my life to the ill. I've committed my life to Jesus Christ. And it just so happens that I see Jesus on the faces of the sick and dying." We'll go back to that other slide. Kara's going to come up here, and she's just going to play a little bit as you pray or think and write down some of the ways that you can be involved in making a difference.